It's great to have you with us, Sherry. We're so excited to chat with you today, and I'm going to jump straight into my first question. Why is climate a national security matter?
Well, thank you, Michelle, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today and this audience. Climate is a national security matter because climate change acts as a threat multiplier, aggravating other security risks we face around the world. Threat multiplier is a term I coined back in 2007 with the first group of US generals and admirals who took a deep dive into the national security implications of climate change at a defense think tank called the Center for Naval Analysis. We spent a year learning from the world's leading climate scientists and other officials about the impact of climate change on our security, and then using the expertise of our generals and admirals and military analysts to examine what those implications are. And we see now that it increases our risks around the world, whether it's in great power competition or it's in terrorism, weapons of mass destruction. General instability is aggravated because climate risks add to all of the severe security threats we face with two wars around the world and a major peer adversary. Climate is just all in this mix as a compound and a cascading risk.
Wow. So many words and terms that we don't really use on a daily basis, like threat multiplier, but we should really be adding to our vocabulary. So, Sherry, when it comes to the US, what would you consider the biggest threats?
Well, we face a variety of threats in the US and around the world. The main threat is that we have tended to think of climate as sort of adding one extra dimension to these other risks that I've just described, whether it's competition with Russia or China, or whether it's the terrorist threat, or whether it's weapons of mass destruction. But climate actually is multiple risks at the same time. So, for example, we might have a more extreme hurricane or extreme weather event or a fire event. That is one event, but often they occur on top of long-term trends from climate change that have already made us more fragile and less stable. For example, parts of the US experience now long-term drought, as do parts of Africa and the Middle East. And when you have extreme weather events on top of the long-term drought or fire on top of areas that have already suffered from devastating rains and landslides, those risks compound and cascade, and they make the combination of that puts more lives at risk. We are constantly now sending our military forces in as emergency responders to back up our firefighters and our search and rescue crews that are responding to floods, hurricanes, fires, and other events, both around the country and increasingly around the globe.
That's really fascinating, Sharon. I think when we think about the military, sometimes we don't always associate it with extreme weather, but more and more we're deploying these resources, and it's definitely impacting our national security because of that. Um, how should we be thinking about climate and national security on a global scale?
Well, we should think about it as affecting missions, not only emissions. So it affects the missions that the military will need to perform. In other words, more search and rescue, more natural disaster assistance and humanitarian relief, but also compounding the other risks that we face around the world and making more areas less stable, because of prolonged drought. For example, across parts of Africa and the Middle East and South Asia, the prolonged drought has has led to food and water insecurity in regions that were already fragile because of political instability or poor, weak governance, because of lack of robust institutions or lack of education or treatment of women and girls. All these things make societies less capable. And then you add the natural system change of climate, the climate changes to the Earth system, and that leads to further instability where people can't grow the crops the way they used to. So agriculture is weaker. People don't have the same resources for water. So traditional farmers and herders in parts of Africa and the Middle East that had lived peaceably before now find themselves more in conflict over water resources. So it's upending what we thought had been a predictable Earth system. And now we have to plan for a world that's much less predictable.
Yeah, predictability, the threat multipliers that are out there. We really need to pay attention and take action soon. Um, as I was learning more about climate and national security, Sherry, one of the topics that kept coming up in the literature was the Arctic. And we don't really talk about the Arctic very much, but we really should. The Arctic is key. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, Michelle, thank you for saying it. The US is, of course, an Arctic nation. Um, but if you're in New York, Washington, San Francisco, Texas, you're not always thinking about that. Um, but the Arctic has changed rapidly in our lifetimes. I mean, it has become a new ocean that's opened up for navigation. And by Russia, it is seen as a toll road for transportation across Russia's northern sea route. And in the future, we could see an ice-free Arctic in the summer as soon as the next decade because of the rapidly retreating sea ice, collapsing permafrost, and rising temperatures. So we'll see more economic competition for trade routes. We also see potentially more competition for the energy and mineral resources that are thought to be vast across the Arctic. Even China has declared itself a near Arctic stakeholder and one with claims to Arctic activities as well. So we now have an area that is competitive where it had been a zone of cooperation. And there's so much at stake in the Arctic because it's changing faster than any place else on the planet. Temperatures rising as much as 4 degrees, and a whole region of the planet that's just become um, completely gone from white to much more green and collapsing permafrost and rising temperatures. And it's still very dangerous to operate in the region, but it's changing rapidly with eyes on the prize of both the trade routes, the energy, and ultimately the migrating fish stocks. As you know, as climate changes the ocean temperatures and as fish become overfished or illegally fished in other parts of the world, fish patterns are changing and they're moving towards both poles, and those regions will have more productive fisheries in the future. So all of that leads to increased potential strategic competition around resources in the Arctic.
Very important information. Thank you, Sherry, for sharing all those points. And I think you've given us a lot to think about. Now, Sherry, you have a book coming out later this year. Can you tell us more about it?
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. I'm happy to, and I hope I have a chance to speak to your listeners and the audience about my book, Threat Multiplier: Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security. It takes readers onto the battlefield and inside the Pentagon to show how the US military is confronting the biggest security risk in global history: climate change. We learn how the military evolved from an environmental laggard to a climate and clean energy leader over the last several decades. And we discover how a warming world exacerbates every threat, from hurricanes and forest fires to terrorism and power plays in Russia and China. The Pentagon now considers climate change in war games, disaster relief planning, international operations, international diplomacy, and even the design of our own military bases. And having served as the Pentagon's first chief environmental officer, the first deputy undersecretary of defense for environmental security, I can give readers a front row seat to the military's fight for global security, a tale that is as hopeful as it is harrowing.
I love that, Sherry. It is as hopeful, and hopeful is a really important word that we should keep in mind as well. Sherry, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. I think the audience is going to walk away with a lot of new things to think about and important things that they should learn about. Thank you so much again, Sherry. We're so glad to have you with us today.
Thank you, Michelle. It's been a pleasure.